So in this section, I'm going to be talking about the impact of the residential school era. This is around the time when the Indian Act was being introduced, and it lasted all the way up until 1996. So can you imagine over 100 years of this stuff I'm going to share with you taking place in our country? Now, I want to read to you, before we get into this, I want to read to you a quote that our Prime Minister had made in the House of Commons to justify from his point of view why they created these residential schools. Canada's first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, told the House of Commons in 1883, "When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training and mode of thought are Indian, he is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself as the head of department that the Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in a central training industrial school, where they will acquire the habits and modes of thoughts of white men. These measures were part of a coherent policy to eliminate Aboriginal people as distinct peoples and to assimilate them into the Canadian mainstream against their will." I wanted to read that to you because this was a policy that was heavily influenced into the present time that we're living in. A lot of the problems that we're facing today, I would say a lot of them came from this era of being forcibly removed from our reserves to go to these schools. Now, I want to touch on this area before we get into this. There's three key areas where this was heavily influenced, run by, and enforced by. When I share these with you, my goal is not to offend. I am here to state factual information that I've learned, I was taught through my university training, that I was taught from other trainers, that I was taught along the journey from oral history, and I'm sharing them with you to help bring awareness, bring empathy, solutions for the future. It was our government who decided and essentially put the stamp on this. This is what's going to happen. We're going to create these Indigenous Indian residential schools. We're going to forcibly remove children from the reserves, go to these schools. We're going to get Catholic Church to come and run these in our country. There's going to be priests and nuns who are going to run these and enforce our own teachings among these peoples of Indigenous populations across Canada. If they do not wish to comply, we are going to get our Mounties to incarcerate the parents who are not in compliance with this law. We are going to remove children, forcibly, essentially kidnap them, take them to these schools, and they're now being forced to learn the way that we feel is adequate and mandatory in our society, which is very racist. That we look at this is a very messed up time in our society. Now, the best way I can explain this is by telling other people's accounts, other people's stories of what they experience. And I'm going to share with you some recommended readings throughout our time. I'll give you the first one here today. This book right here, it's called The Education of Augie Marasti. This is a memoir of a person who went to one of these schools, and he talks of his experiences of what he went through, the abuse, the sexual abuse, starvation, and so on, and witnessing people who never made it home. When we look at the present landscape that we're sharing right now, one of the things that's really escalated the urgency to bring Indigenous awareness trainings to our communities, our towns, our municipalities, our businesses, and so on, is the uncovering of these mass graves that we're finding at past residential school sites. It started out in BC. Now it's going all the way across the country. We haven't even hit the majority of these sites, and we're already at thousands upon thousands of undiscovered graves of children who went to these schools. I remember many years ago, I was a university student. And at that time, there was a leader who talked about there was a genocide in our country of Canada. And the rest of society rose up against what that person said. They couldn't believe it. In fact, they made him apologize. When we look back almost 20 years from that point to this present, it is now being confirmed that this was a form of genocide, where many of these children were killed at these schools. They were starved. They were abused in every single form imaginable. These resources will help to justify some of these teachings to you. I want to give you a few more recommended movies that I'll get you to watch. Number one is Indian Horse. Indian Horse, you can rent that online. Another one you can rent online is We Were Children. It's a documentary of some of these children that went to these schools and their experiences of going there. These children were forcibly removed from their homes, being put in the back of wagons where they were carted off like cattle to these schools. When they got there, they were not permitted to practice their language, their culture, their braids were cut. They were forced to wear a uniform. They all lived in one big room. They experienced things that we can't comprehend in this present moment. It's very difficult to hear these stories that some of them I'm going to share with you today. I'll give you two examples today, just to help justify this time. When you take children from their home, that first 0 to 6 years of their life is extremely important. This is where they're learning about how to communicate, how to love, who they can rely on, how to speak to people, how to work with their families at school and so on. When you take them away at a young age and you put them in a place where all they experience is trauma, abuse, and so on, and it wasn't even a school, they were slave laborers at these schools. When you put them in environments like that and you expect them to go out as the ones who were able to survive that and go out as teens into the mainstream, that's a recipe for disaster, because you took away everything from them. And they go into a society where it's often very racist at that time, and they don't feel included in towns and cities. They go back to their communities, their reserves. They don't feel included because they lost their way of life, their culture, and so on. So where do they go? Some of them go to the streets. Some of them go and resort to addiction to cope with pain. There was no resources that we have to this present moment of how to deal with trauma, how to deal with pain, how to get counseling and therapy and so on. There was nothing like that for them back then. So it created a big cycle of trauma, intergenerational trauma that's now passed from one kid to their kids and so on. And that's what we're facing right now in this moment. We're trying to go back and heal and trying to help our loved ones and so on. So let's go back into these stories here. I've heard countless accounts of people who were physically abused, who were sexually abused. Some of the kids were experimented on. I'm going to say that again. Some of these kids were experimented on. There was tests done on them that society doesn't know about. I've heard stories of kids being kicked downstairs, thrown out windows. I've heard stories of people giving birth to children as preteens in those schools, only to discover their baby being murdered, thrown out the window, and so on. There's children that tried to run home only to freeze to death, only to be captured, and all of a sudden they didn't show up. These kids don't know where their friend went. They were found by the priest, by the nun, but all of a sudden they didn't come back. Where did they go? There's stories upon stories I could share with you. I'll share with you a personal account with one of my best friends. His grandmother went to a school down south in southern Saskatchewan. And when she was a young girl, she was forcibly removed from her home. And she went to a school like this. As she became a preteen, the priest took interest into her, eventually raped her, impregnated her. 9 months later, she gives birth to a child. The nun wraps that child in a white blanket and it instructs that young mother to take that baby and place it in the incinerator. When we look at the present landscape of the discovering of these mass graves, it's going to keep happening. We're going to keep finding these children who were lost. I also feel for the ones who lost their lives like that we're not going to find. The ones who were burnt to death, the ones who were buried on the outskirts of these schools and so on. There's many more places like that. That's who I feel for. I want to share with you a recommended reading that will help you to give insights into Métis history. This is a book called Half-Breed by Maria Campbell. Amazing book. This also was a history that took place during this time, where they used to call Métis people half-breeds back then. That was a term that they used. This is a time when they were not on reserves. They were basically left to fend for themselves. They were kind of in between, on reserves and the towns, the farms, municipalities kind of left to fend for themselves. This will give you an insight into Métis history and how it's shaped today. The next recommended reading I want to share with you is called Call Me Indian. This person who wrote this is late Fred Sasakamoose. He was the first First Nations NHL hockey player ever to make it big. And he tells his whole account, his legacy of living through, surviving the residential school era. This man was a legend to us. He passed away, unfortunately, during COVID. His story is extremely powerful. When we used to hear him speak, it was extremely powerful. These accounts that I'm sharing with you are extremely powerful. I shared with you a lot of the introduction with the stories of how things have impacted today. The accounts of many of these children who were abused in all these different ways and so on. During the 1960s, one of the things that continued to, we'll say, wreak havoc on Indigenous peoples is our government took it upon themselves to claim the child welfare system, to take over that area. And unfortunately, even to this present day, majority of them, children who are in care, are Indigenous people. And so they developed this time frame of the 60s scoop. They forcibly removed children from homes, from newborns, from their mothers in hospitals, and they would advertise them to non-Indigenous families that these children needed places to live. So now they're being forcibly removed from their homes, put in non-Indigenous families, children in care being removed, and they lost all of their Indigenous identity, their roots, and so on. When we look at the present landscape, the child welfare system, children in foster care and so on, is still a major hurdle for Indigenous peoples. Majority of them, unfortunately, are Indigenous peoples in there. My wife is a teacher right now in Saskatoon. There's children who get off the bus who are coming from their foster care homes. They're in between their own parents. Their siblings are split up across different foster families. That has to change. We have to find ways to help these parents to heal through their trauma so that they can become parents and be able to raise their children. This is all a result from all the intergenerational injustices. Majority of this can be fixed, but we have to work together. We have to fast track this stuff. All of what I've shared with you, all of the stuff that I'm sharing with you, ladies and gentlemen, happened in our society. The effects are still living. The effects that we feel as human beings in our society is very prevalent. When we see Indigenous people struggling out there, we can tie it back to a lot of these roots that I'm sharing with you today. I'm highlighting a lot of these areas. A lot of the details we can find in our textbooks online through more Indigenous awareness workshops and so on. But we have to make it a priority to learn this stuff in order to build that awareness, understand the truth, understand the stories, so we can bring it back home, bring it to our organizations, bring it to our companies, and find ways and with tools and strategies to make it better for the future. Starts at home, starts with our children, starts with our families. But you have to make a conscious choice to make this a priority. So in the first part, I shared with you the histories, what's created today. I shared with you the histories of the past and so on. Some of the current histories is our Prime Minister finally acknowledged, our past Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, finally acknowledged and apologized about the residential school era and the devastation that it created in our society, the injustices. We had the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation reports that were created by Indigenous leaders and so on to help our communities, our businesses find ways to work, to thrive, and to create a win-win scenario for the mainstream to heal and to honor treaties, honor agreements that were set long ago. My goal is that what I share with you today is that you take it back home and you work through it, you absorb it, and that our children build the future of tomorrow. I'm excited for that. In the next section, I'm going to talk about the present landscape and how all this ties in together and what we can do to move forward.